Attention on deck.
Carry on, please. Hey, how are you? Carry on, let me sit down. How are you? You know, I'm meeting with the Japanese later today.
You do? Well, yes. I have to give them tours and feed them all the time. Once I would have really waited for a while, but it's really because it was.
I apologize for being late, so thank you so much. I know you guys are really good use. You can see by this sort of turnout the interest that you've grown. One of our lines of effort is to understand and embrace our past with an eye to the future. So always take these lessons thinking about what applies to today's and tomorrow's challenges.
Not a problem. I hope I will be equal to the task.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. First, again, good afternoon and thanks very much to everyone for coming today as we commemorate the 76th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. You know, it's a CNO directive each year that we take time to drill down on this event and specifically what occurred during the days, 3 to 7 June 1942. An event that surely changed the course of history, world history. So as we do this today, CNO has asked us in the Nav Avenue to specifically look at some core attributes: toughness, inspiration, accountability, and integrity of American sailors and civilians. So again, thanks to everyone who's here today to do that. Also, he calls out in the Nav Avenue, it's a specific opportunity to draw parallels between today's forward deployed naval forces and the historical lessons of the battle. I think we're going to be able to do that today with Mr. Weadon's help. So we have a special guest, Mr. Patrick Weadon. He's the curator of NSA's Cryptologic Museum. Prior to his current position, Mr. Weadon spent 20 years with NSA as a special agent, as an intel analyst. He's a former IS, was on active duty just after 9/11, was a reservist for many years. He's a graduate of Catholic University, has multiple degrees in history, a native of Washington, D.C., and a big hockey fan. So you may think that he was very pleased with Saturday night's results and possibly what we'll see tonight, but even better, he's a Bruins fan. And so,
sorry about that.
Mr. Weadon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. All right. Now, first off, Admiral, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the entire staff, particularly Chief Fisher. Their staff work was absolutely flawless. I have to tell you, and I'm not being obsequious or insincere, this is truly an honor and a pleasure for me. This is really a labor of love. So I want to thank you for having me today, and I hope what I'm going to talk about is going to be useful, not only in terms of understanding the usable past, as historians like to call it, but for being able to apply some of the lessons of Midway to today's challenges. Now, it's a good thing that we have so many people here today, because not everyone is interested in history. In fact, there's probably somebody in this crowd who says, oh my God, we have to listen to another history briefing. Not everybody loves history. I'll give you a perfect example. About 15 years ago, I was about to give a briefing on the Battle of Midway, as one would have it. And everything at NSA has to be checked and double-checked. They have to make sure that you're not going to give away the store, and also that you're not going to embarrass the United States government, particularly the agency. So you have to have everything vetted and reviewed and reviewed and vetted. And there was a wonderful woman. She's one of the best staff officers I ever worked with. Her name is Jane. I won't tell her last name. And Jane was looking at my Midway brief, and about halfway through, she said, Mr. Weadon, or Patrick, she said, there's a problem here. You keep referring to Admiral Nelson as the Asian, or rather Admiral Yamamoto as the Asian version of Admiral Nelson. And she said, I don't know who Admiral Nelson is. And you really need to flesh that out. And I said, Jane, listen, no disrespect to you. You're one of the best staff officers I ever worked with, but you obviously were asleep in history class. Everyone knows who Admiral Nelson is. I don't need to extrapolate on that. She goes, well, I'm in charge and I'm your supervisor and you are going to extrapolate. And I said, Jane, I'm sorry, but it's ridiculous. I don't need to tell anybody anything more. everyone knows who Admiral Nelson is. And with that, she yelled out across the cubicles at NSA. If you've ever been there, it's like a gopher farm. She yelled, "Hey, does anybody in here know where Admiral Nelson is?" And a voice came back over, "I think he was on I Dream of Jeannie." So not everybody is well versed in history. But to get serious for a moment, I believe, Chief Fisher, correct me if I'm wrong, the original date of this briefing was supposed to be the 6th of June, which is fine because not only is that another momentous day in history, the invasion of Normandy, but it also was during the Battle of Midway. So it wouldn't have been inappropriate. But it's particularly wonderful that we switched it, or that you switched it to today, because today is the day when really the intelligence and the strategy and the training really paid off. So I will tell you that it was about 10:15 on June 4th that a collection of dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown found 3 of Japan's best carriers, and in a total of 25 minutes, that's all it took, all 3 carriers were burning and headed for the bottom of the sea. We sunk a 4th carrier later that day. All 4 of those carriers had been at Pearl Harbor. Before that 25 minutes, you could make a good case that the United States was losing the war, and after it, we are on our way to winning the war. So I'm not good at math, so I was trying to do the time adjustment today. So if you're so inclined today, whatever you're doing at about 3:15, I want you to look to the west and think for a moment about the incredible things that happen. You have to adjust for the time. But really, this is a red letter day, as Chief Fisher said, not only for the U.S. Navy, but really in world history. Now, we all know about the Battle of Midway. I imagine in boot camp, they probably went over it. It's something that everybody that wears the uniform should know. In fact, it's something every American should know. But you know about how critical it was. For those of you that didn't know, I just told you. But you know, what I'd like to do today is to focus on some interesting points and things that you might not know, because you already know the general gist of it. And so the title of my brief is 5 and perhaps a few more things you might not have known about the Battle of Midway. Now, I'm going to apologize to historians in the group or knowledgeable people who already know these things, but I would imagine that most of you don't. I always start my briefings when I talk about the Battle of Midway, talking about my Uncle Joe. And you say, well, what does he have to do with this? Well, I will admit to you, he did not serve in the Battle of Midway. He had not gotten out to the Pacific yet. But my Uncle Joe was on the Enterprise. He was a torpedo pilot. He served 3 full combat tours. He won the Navy Cross. He helped to damage a Japanese destroyer that never went back to sea afterwards. Didn't quite sink her, but she wasn't of any use to the Japanese Navy after that. And he did immeasurable other things. He was part of the very first night attack from a U.S. carrier. It was part of VT-10, the Buzzard Brigade. And as I told Chief Fisher, when I was about 9 years old, my aunt told me that my uncle was a war hero. And I had a great interest in World War II even at that age. And I would bug him, and being a true veteran, he didn't want to talk about this stuff. But he did eventually. I could pull it out of him. And he told me some amazing stories, hair-raising stories. We've talked a lot about the Greatest Generation, and that's for good reason, because in many ways they were. But I would always submit to you that the people who fought in battles like Midway, when they came back to the United States, there really wasn't any other serious challenge that they were going to face. So it's no wonder that the country thrived after the war. But my uncle really was an inspiration to me, and he's one of the reasons why I have such a passion for this. So I'd like to dedicate this briefing to him, but not only to him, to all the men and women who have ever served in the United States Navy, particularly you. First point that I'd like to make, the first amazing story. We all know about Commander Joseph Rochefort. There's his picture. Commander Rochefort was an officer, of course, but he was a Mustang. He came up from the enlisted ranks. He was not a graduate of Annapolis, which in this day and time was a bit of a serious handicap, but he didn't let it stop him. He was a bit of a rebel. He probably spoke up sometimes when he shouldn't have, didn't probably show the proper military respect, but he was somebody that really knew his business. He was sent to Japan as a young ensign and told to do 2 things. We want you to learn Japanese and stay out of trouble. He did both. And he also was a very accomplished cryptanalyst, to the point where he was appointed head of Station Hypo, which was really, to my mind, the main organization that was able to break the Japanese code. It was in the basement of Nimitz's headquarters. It was called the Dungeon. And Rochefort drove his men relentlessly to break JN-25B. Now, I don't want to get into a code breaking lesson here because it'll get boring awfully quickly, but the Japanese naval code was a collection of numbers. There were a series of numbers, and those numbers would represent a person, place, or implement of war. And you would send that number out, but before you send it out, you would go to an additive table, and you would either add or subtract the additive table, and the person at the end would do the opposite. And if you run that system perfectly, it's very hard to break, particularly because they change the additive tables every 30 days. However, most people don't realize this, but after Pearl Harbor, and you could use this today, Admiral, the Japanese conquered over 1/7 of the Earth's surface in about 6 months' time. We totally underestimated them. But part of the problem for them was they conquered so much territory they could not get the additive tables out to the far-flung reaches of their empire. So they had to extend it to 60 days. And it was within that window that Station Hypo was able to finally break JN-25B. We had not broken the Japanese naval code up to that time. Don't believe anybody that tells you that we did. But when we break it, we learn very quickly exactly what the Japanese are going to do. And we're able to relay that to the upper levels of command. You probably know the famous story. The people in Washington had some doubts about whether Rochefort's analysis was correct. Rochefort had come to the conclusion that when the Japanese talked about objective AF, Alpha Foxtrot, that they were talking about Midway. And every message that they're sending talks about the upcoming attack on AF. Washington disagreed. Actually, they didn't disagree. They just second-guessed Admiral Nimitz to the point where Rochefort said, "Sir, we need to prove to them that we're right." And at Rochefort's suggestion, Nimitz sent a message to the Marine Radio Center at Midway telling them to put out a message that evening saying that the water plant on the island was broken and that there was a serious problem on the island. That message went out in hopes the Japanese would intercept it. They did. How do we know? 2 days later, we intercepted a Japanese naval message sent from Guam. It was the minutes of an intelligence meeting that had been held back in Tokyo. And guess what the second topic of conversation was? AF is short of water. They proved their point. Nimitz was able to put his small but determined force in the perfect spot to stage a nautical ambush. So we know that. And that is an incredible story. But guess what? On May 27th, the Japanese changed their additive tables. So for all of the intelligence that we had, and all the hard work that was done, during the Battle of Midway, we could not read Japanese communications, and most people don't know that. And that's a little scary. But here's the point. When we talk about signals intelligence, we always use the analogy of being able to hear what the other team's huddle or what the quarterback in the other team's huddle is saying, sticking your nose in the other team's huddle. Well, the good news is, even though we couldn't read Japanese communications during the battle, even though we were in the dark and we were having to go back to the drawing board, the Japanese had broken the huddle. They were headed out onto the line of scrimmage, and their quarterback, sorry about the sports analogies, I fall back on them too much, their quarterback was not going to call any audibles. Why did he need to? They had beaten up the United States Navy in just about every conflict after Pearl Harbor. Japan was going to do what Japan had intended to do. And there was no reason to think that they weren't going to be successful. They'd been successful in every other battle. But the work that Rochefort and the men of Station Hypo did prepared the United States to be able to meet this challenge. But it is a fact that during the battle itself, and this is the first amazing fact, at least hopefully maybe some of you didn't know, we were actually in the dark. Number two, the air crews of the USS Hornet. Now remember, there were two task forces. The Enterprise and the Hornet were one, and that was under Admiral Spruance. And then the other task force was just one aircraft carrier. That was under Admiral Fletcher. It's worth noting, for those of you that maybe aren't that familiar with the Battle of Midway, that the Yorktown had been beat up pretty badly at Coral, not pretty badly, she'd been beat up very badly at Coral Sea, and she limped into port, and this is a famous story. when Admiral Nimitz asked the dockmaster how long it would take for Yorktown to be able to go back to sea, because they wanted her to go back immediately to meet the threat at Midway, the dockmaster said, it's going to take about 3 months, sir, to get her ready to go back. Nimitz said, you have 72 hours. They had every person that could swing a hammer and knew anything at all about repairing ships on the Yorktown. And when she did go to sea, her boilers were braced with wooden 2x4s. Now, she could launch and recover aircraft, but she was not at full strength. So the United States goes into the Battle of Midway with basically 2.5 aircraft carriers. The Japanese have 8. And as I said, they have over 200 ships. We have barely 50. So this is a very, very, some would say, desperate situation. And what made it even more desperate was, and this is the second amazing fact, the air crews, who really are the ones who carry the fight to the enemy, the air crews of the Hornet had never been in battle before. They were complete rookies. Now, they were well trained. The Navy's training at Pensacola is outstanding. My uncle told me about it, and it still is outstanding today. It's probably the best training center in the world for naval aviators, bar none. But even though you're trained, we all know what it's like our first day on the job. And I don't care what you do for the Navy, whether you're a bosun's mate or whether you're an intelligence analyst or a ship driver, the first time you ever do something, it's, at least for me anyway, there are probably some wonder kinds in this office or in this meeting. The first time you do something, you have to kind of feel your way through. You almost have to make mistakes no matter how well trained you are, because this is the first time you've ever met. So again, not only are we going in with 2.5 aircraft carriers, but one of the air crews, particularly the one on the Yorktown, had never been in battle before. Now, the good news was the Enterprise was in top shape with seasoned fighters. However, as I note, the air groups on the Hornet had never, ever done this. And this was a tragedy, because this is another legendary story from Midway. Now, part of the problem is when you know exactly what your opponent's going to do. I mean, this is a good thing and a bad thing. You want to be able to get them before they get you. They knew that the Japanese had no clue that we were out there. They believed that our carriers were back in Pearl Harbor, and they are truly clueless about what the Americans are doing. With that in mind, they want to get the Japanese before they realize what the heck is happening. And because of this, in the early stages of the Battle of Midway, and by the way, this is another fact that you can bring up, there's a tendency to think, oh, we go out and we meet the Japanese and we bushwhack them, and all of a sudden, you know, we've turned the tide in the Pacific. The early stages of the Battle of Midway did not go well, because when you send out a torpedo plane, and these were devastators, they're big, they're heavy, and it's kind of like flying a Volkswagen bus. And you've got Japanese Zeros zipping around you that are like Ferraris. You've got to go in with fighter cover. You've got to have top cover. People use that expression all the time for good reason. Well, many of their torpedo squadrons actually they lost the fighter cover. And when they got to the point where they located the Pacific, or rather the Japanese fleet, they went in unprotected. Now, there was a combination of a couple of things. First off, they didn't have fighter cover. Second, they were flying the Devastator, which by that time was a plane. It was a torpedo bomber, but it really was kind of outmoded. It wasn't as fast as a lot of the Japanese aircraft, and it really did not do well. And because of that, and by the way, I don't want to question the courage and the bravery of the people who were in the torpedo squadrons, because it took a lot of guts to go in without fighter cover. And they did a very good job at keeping the Japanese occupied. Unfortunately, when you've got a bunch of rookies and your aircraft is not quite as good as the people you're going up against, sometimes you're going to come out on the short end of the stick. And sadly, Torpedo Squadron 8 was almost totally wiped out to a man. Now, there was one person who survived. His name was Lieutenant Ensign George Gay. He died about 2 years ago. And Ensign Gay was able to bail out, and he literally hid under a flotation device so the Japanese wouldn't see him, and he got a front row seat for the destruction of the free aircraft, of the 3 aircraft that I talked about a moment ago. But the bottom line is, not only were the torpedo squadrons on the Yorktown having a tough time that day, but the Devastator aircraft really didn't do very well. of the 49 torpedo bombers that were launched against the Japanese, only 2 of them came back. Now, as my uncle will tell you, after Midway, they realized the Devastator was not going to make the grade, and they replaced it with another aircraft called the Avenger. Now, interestingly enough, half of the aircrew of the Yorktown was left back in Norfolk to test out this new Avenger aircraft. And they were supposed to fly out to the West Coast and be transported to Hawaii, but they arrived there a day after the Hornet had already sortied, after she'd already sailed. So the Avenger would be able to do a much better job. But on the day of the battle, the air crews of the Hornet were inexperienced, and unfortunately, situations like Torpedo 8 were all too common. Story number 3, and this is one of my favorite ones. Now, the chain of command today asked me to make sure that I don't just talk about history, that I bring real examples of what happened during the Battle of Midway that can be applied to today. So this is the story of how Commander Wade McCluskey was able to make a critical decision that helped the United States Navy airmen and planes to find the Japanese Navy. So we're going to talk first about Commander William Buckman. He is or Brockman rather. He is the commander of the USS Nautilus. And like most people in the silent service, the submariner, he is aggressive. He likes to go after his prey. And he's got a lot of courage and bravery and nerve and guts. And one of the things that's amazing to me, because I've read every book on Midway, is that the Japanese were so confident that they knew everything, that even when there was really clear evidence that something was not quite what they believed to be, they just completely ignored it. Early in the morning of June 4th, Brockman is harassing the Japanese fleet. He's going in, they're locating him, and they're throwing depth charges at him, and he's trying to get a shot. He's harassing the Japanese fleet. He's doing a very good job of it. But they didn't think for a moment that the presence of an American submarine might be a clue that there was something else going on. But Brockman keeps going in. It gets a little too hot. He pulls back. He goes in again. It gets a little too hot. Then they start to depth charge him. And finally, the Japanese send a destroyer after him, the Arashi. And the captain of the Hirashi is somebody that wants to get rid of this submarine because really for a long time it was the only threat that the Japanese were dealing with. Well, Brockman realizes very quickly that now they're on to him.